Hi, everyone. It's Mrs. Bourgeois here to share Chapter 7 from Almost Super. So excited to be able to read with you today. So, Chapter 7 is titled Watch This. I met Benny outside his class right as lunch began. Students poured out of the rooms, pushing and shoving their ways into the halls. We fought through the crowd, making our way toward the library. In chaos, I could talk to Benny in relative privacy. We've got to move fast, I told Benny about the new teacher. There are now two Johnsons right here inside the school, and one of them is a you know what. A super is what I wanted to say, but I couldn't. So I shook my fist. Benny raised his eyebrows. Will you have to shake your fist every time you talk to your teacher? And what about parent teacher conferences? Holy cow, that's going to be awkward. We got to the library. I stepped inside and pulled out my phone to text Rodney. Send Juanita. I was about to hit send when I happened to glance up, and sitting at a table toward the back of the library with his feet on the table was Juanita Johnson. Sitting at a table toward the back of the library with her feet on the table was Juanita Johnson. She was reading a book. I lurched to stop, and Benny crashed right into me. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed Benny by the sleeve and I ducked behind a book cart off to my left. I fell to the ground, pulling Benny down next to me. My brother crouched on his hands and knees, looking at me in alarm. What is it? Why did you? I put a finger to my lips and Benny fell silent. I raised my head, peeking around the corner of the cart. Juanita was totally engrossed in her book. I didn't think she'd seen us. Scanning the room, I could see Mr. Wells in his office eating lunch, but there was no sign of anyone else. Juanita looked up and I dropped back behind the cart. Benny mouthed the words, What's going on? I motioned toward where Juanita was sitting and mouthed her name. Benny peeked around the cart and whispered, So, isn't the whole plan to talk to her and find out what the Johnsons did to our powers? He shook his fist. But she shouldn't be here, I said. I was counting on surprising her. Rodney was going to send her a text, but it's like she knew exactly what. And then it hit me. I smacked my forehead. I'm so dumb. What? Benny asked. We talked about our plan on the bus. You're not making any sense, Benny said. Juanita is a super, I explained. That means she has super hearing. She probably sat in the back of the bus and heard every word we said. If she knows our plan, we could be walking right into a trap. A trap? Benny said. In the library? What kind of trap can you set in the library? What's she gonna do? Throw a I love to read poster at us? My brother had a point. As long as Mr. Wells was watching, she wouldn't be able to use her powers against us. This wasn't part of the original plan, I said. Benny shrugged. We'll wing it. Wing it? I took a deep breath. Okay, get ready. I stood up. Juanita was gone. Benny got up and looked around. Well, that's a little strange, he muttered. In front of us was an open table. Tables where students could read dotted the floor. The only way Juanita could have gotten past us was to walk through the door behind us. There was a desk to one side of the door where Mr. Wells checked out the books. That left one other place. She must have gone back into the stacks, Benny said. To our right, a large bookshelf divided the open area and the stacks. Our library is a little different from most other schools. One of the parents in the school district made a lot of money selling mechanical bookcases to big universities and public libraries. And when they remodeled our school about 5 years ago, the parent donated one of these systems. The bookshelves are mostly crammed together with just a few aisles in between. When you press the button on one side of the bookcase, the aisle in front of you opens up, and somewhere else, the bookcases close. The good news is this allows you to pack more books into a smaller place. The bad news is a supervillain can use this to her advantage. Uh, Benny, I said. Yeah, I think I just realized how Juanita could spring a trap. I pointed to the area in the library into which Juanita had disappeared. With one press of a button, she could smash us flat. Benny shook his head. That's not how it works. There's a safety mechanism that keeps that from happening. If somebody is in an aisle, then the bookcases don't close. Benny, Juanita has all the powers. How long do you think it will take Rodney to disable that safety mechanism? I asked. Benny looked over at me. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Then he finally spoke. That's not so good. I hesitated. We were still standing close enough to the door that we could run away. Students were walking through the halls on the way to the cafeteria. Juanita might not dare to attack us out in the open, but if we went back into the stacks, we'd be out of sight of both the students and Mr. Wells. Benny saw my hesitation. Rafter, he said. If we don't face Juanita now, we'll be afraid every single day for the rest of our lives. This is what being super is all about. I wondered if this was the ferocious courage that Grandpa had talked about, or if it was the healthy dose of insanity. Maybe it was a little of both. Stay close, I said. We'll go into the stacks just long enough to lead Juanita back out here into the open area. You got it? Benny nodded. A long bookcase stood before us, and on the left was a walkway leading back to the stacks. A large mural of split rock was painted on the wall, and on the right was another walkway, also leading to the stacks. I walked slowly down the walkway to the left. I kept my eyes trained right, searching for Juanita. When we reached the back wall, we still had not seen her. Where did she go? Benny asked. She must be hiding on the other side, I whispered. Either that or she's invisible. We stood in the corner of the stacks with the mural behind us. I felt more than a little claustrophobic. We could scoot to the other walkway, but that meant just walking between the bookcase and the solid brick wall. Juanita would be able to close the shelves on us. It's like being stuck between a rock and a bookcase. Benny was trying to be funny, but his voice sounded very nervous. I took a step into the aisle. There were about 3 feet between the brick wall to my left and the bookcase to my right. The shelves didn't move fast, but Juanita might have modified that as well. The bookcase loomed like a wave waiting to crash over us. I took another step and then another. We were halfway back down the aisle when I heard Juanita's voice pierce the quiet library. Show me what you've got, villains. Make your move. I stopped dead in my tracks. My brain couldn't register what she had just said. Benny spoke from behind me, calling into the shelves. Who in the heck are you talking to? Again, Juanita's voice floated through the library. It hissed in my ear. To the only villains in this school, Raptor and Benny Bailey. I heard what sounded like a splitting noise. Benny twirled his finger around his ear and he mouthed the word cuckoo. We're not villains. I felt like an idiot for stating such an obvious fact. I also felt like an idiot talking to a bunch of books on a shelf. My words were met with a burst of laughter. Right, not villains. You boys must think I'm a moron. Now that's the first thing you've said that makes sense, said Benny. The floor began vibrating under my feet. The shelves were moving. Aunt Verna once told me that a little bit of knowledge never hurt anybody. But Aunt Verna had never been trapped in the stacks with a super. We were about to be crushed by knowledge. I spun on my heels and I pushed Benny backward towards the mural and to safety. I couldn't be sure the bookcase was closing in on us, but when we got to the end and I turned around, I saw the stack slowly close against the brick wall. At least Juanita hadn't adjusted the speed. This is a serious misuse of school property, Benny said, shaking his head. My goal had been to lead Juanita into the open area, but now I was mad. Come on, I spoke so that only Benny could hear. We're done being pushed around. I walked past several bookcases until I came to an open aisle. I took a few steps in and then bent over. Peering between the books and on the shelves, I saw a pair of jeans among the stacks. Juanita was 2 aisles in front of me, walking carefully toward the mural. I stood up. I moved in the opposite direction. I wanted to circle around and come up behind her. Benny followed. Lie all you want, I said, loud enough for Juanita to hear me. The Baileys are the upholders of the truth and justice in Split Rock. So, you Baileys decided to destroy the White Knight Diamond in the name of truth and justice? There was another splitting sound. No, we kept you from stealing it. I got to the end of the aisle, I turned right around the corner, and I entered the aisle where I'd seen the jeans. Juanita was crouched down, looking between the shelves. I wondered why she wasn't using her X-ray vision. When she spotted me, she stood up straight. Knowing she had been caught, her face flushed, and for a moment, I thought she looked uncertain. Then she scowled and folded her arms across her chest. Her dark curly hair was falling over both shoulders. Juanita Johnson did not look nice. I could almost imagine fire or lasers or lava shooting out of her eyes. I had to will my feet to stand firm. Benny came and stood next to me, and that helped. Oh, that's a good one, Juanita said. Break into a museum, destroy a national treasure, and then try to blame it on us? Your family is always involved in evil plans, she continued. Like the battle last fall when you tried building the giant laser in the thermal underwear factory? A laser? In a thermal underwear factory? Can you even hear how crazy you sound? Why would anybody do that? Because you Baileys are all crazy. Juanita turned her head and spit. There was a garbage can in the general direction, and she turned. But I doubted she could be that accurate. That's just like vandalism, Benny said. You might as well spray paint the mural. I wondered how I could get Juanita back out into the open, and then I realized I could beat her at her own game. I reached up, I pressed the button on the side of the bookcase, and the grinding under our feet resumed as the stacks began to slide. I ran toward the open area in the library with Benny on my heels. I cleared the end of the stacks and froze. Mr. Wells sat at his desk, talking to my new teacher, Mr. Johnson. Back in the stacks, this game of cat and mouse was getting intense. There were too many cats. To leave the library, we would have to walk right past a supervillain. But if we kept running around inside the stacks, we risked bumping into the supervillain. We couldn't go left or right. We couldn't go forward or back. That left only one option: up. Finding an open aisle, I placed my foot on the lowest shelf, testing its strength. I climbed hand over hand until I got to the top of the shelf. Crawling on top of the bookcase, I turned around and motioned for Benny to come up. He started to climb. Benny was almost to the top when I heard the familiar rumble and I looked down. The bookcases were closing in on him. "Benny," I whispered, "give me your hand." "I can't." Benny clung to the bookcase. "If I give you my hand, I'm going to fall." Oh no, I had forgotten. Benny didn't like heights, but there was no time to argue. Lying flat on my stomach, I grabbed the opposite side of the shelf with one hand and I reached down with the other and I grabbed Benny's belt. I pulled hard, hauling him up out of the aisle. The stacks closed together, just missing his right leg. Benny and I lay flat on the shelves. My brother gasped. He hung on for dear life. "You just gave me the mother of all wedgies," he said, "and I can't even let go to straighten things up." I got to my feet, crouching low so I wouldn't be seen by Mr. Wells or Mr. Johnson at the front of the library. Juanita had to be farther back into the stacks, which meant there was now a gaping chasm between her and me. I looked down. The carpet didn't look that soft. And if I was caught jumping on top of the bookcases, somehow I didn't think Mr. Wells would be too happy about that. But I was a superhero. Risk was just part of my job description. I spit into my hands. I wiped them on the bottom of my shoes. I didn't want to slip on the dusty bookcases. I stepped to the edge of the shelves. I bent over and jumped. As soon as I was airborne, I heard the bookcases rumble. My instincts took over. The shelf I was jumping to was sliding forward, and now I was headed toward an empty space. I collided with the side of the shelf, unable to stop. But I pushed myself off almost as soon as I touched it. Instead of falling into the new aisle that was opening up, I went farther than I meant to, and I landed on top of a group of bookshelves, rolling onto my side. Luckily, there were 5 shelves pressed together, and I had time to bring myself to a stop. Benny was still hanging on to the top of the first bookcase for dear life, but he managed to give me a thumbs up and a grin. I pointed to my eyes with 2 fingers and then to Benny. I motioned in the direction of Mr. Wells and Mr. Johnson. I wanted Benny to watch and give me some kind of signal if either of them moved. Benny nodded and scooted to where he could watch. I only hoped that he understood. I was covered in the thick dust and felt a scratch in my throat. I resisted the urge to cough and I crawled over the top of the bookcases. Finally, I came to the next open aisle and looked down. Juanita was crouched below, peering between the shelves. She was hunting us all right, but why wasn't she using her super hearing or her speed? Maybe I could be a little more bold. I thought back to where she said about the battle of the thermal underwear factory. I remembered that battle. Swinging my feet over the bookcase, I took a deep breath. I pushed off and I dropped to the floor. I landed 2 feet from Juanita, and was rewarded with a look of alarm. Juanita stumbled and fell, landing on her rear end. She scooted back on her hands and her feet. I spoke calmly to show I was in complete control. We got a call from a citizen telling us you were smuggling illegal weapons into the country. Juanita scrambled to her feet, glaring at me, and I kept right on talking. And your family was storing them in the factory. That was one of the greatest battles ever. We beat you even though we were down by 3 people because Uncle Ralph and his family all had dental appointments. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe for Juanita to attack or for her to keep telling lies, but I was ready for anything except what happened next. Juanita softened. The anger in her face diminished and turned into confusion. We weren't smuggling weapons, she said. What are you talking about? The thermal underwear factory? Juanita looked like she was trying to read my mind. We got a call from a citizen warning us that you were building a laser. We saved the day by destroying the machinery. I shook my head. No, I'm pretty sure that the machinery was what they used to make thermal underwear. Juanita got to the end of the aisle. Don't try to confuse me, Rafter Bailey. She turned her head and made a spitting noise. This time I thought I heard something hit the plastic lining of a garbage can. Juanita pointed at her chest with her thumb. We are the superheroes. You are the villains. She reached over to the shelf. She pressed the button. I was still in the middle of the aisle. No time to reach either end. I jumped back on the shelves and started to climb. The bookcases were closing together, and I got to the top just as the shelves slammed shut under me. I signaled to Benny to let me know I was okay. He was waving his arms furiously. He was pointing toward the wall on my left, and I looked over and saw the top of a head bobbing between the bookshelves, and a new voice penetrated the stacks of the library. Juanita? Are you back here? Mr. Johnson. I lay down on top of the shelf, trying to make myself look as flat as possible. I'm over here, Uncle Nicholas. Mr. Johnson found Juanita. Are you okay? I looked for you after lunch. Mr. Johnson didn't sound like a supervillain. He sounded like a concerned uncle. All Juanita had to do was tell her uncle where we were. There was no escape. Juanita was silent for several moments, and then she spoke. I'm fine. What? Why wasn't she telling on us? All right, Mr. Johnson said. I need to get back to class. I'll see you after school. Thanks, Uncle Nicholas. I watched as Mr. Johnson's bobbing head until it left the stacks. Juanita walked over just behind me, turning back only once to glance over her shoulder. Our eyes met, but I could not read her. I got to my feet, perching like a gargoyle on the top of a library bookcase. What was going on? Benny wobbled to his feet, trying to mimic my actions despite his fear of heights. He licked his hands and wiped them on his feet. He jumped over the aisle and then came and sat next to me. What was that all about? He whispered. What happened? Before I could admit I had no idea, I saw a bald head turn the corner and re-enter the stacks. Mr. Johnson had doubled back into the library. Get down, I whispered to Benny. I dropped to my stomach, and the library was quiet enough that I could hear his footsteps along the side of the stacks. After a moment, he stopped. I am here at this school to protect my niece. Mr. Johnson's voice was flat. She is important to me. I will not be very nice to anyone who tries to hurt her. Mr. Johnson was moving again. Benny opened his mouth, but I shook my head sharply to silence him. But Benny couldn't control it. He looked like he was about to sneeze. I waved my hands trying to get him to stop, but there really wasn't any point. Benny curled up on top of the shelves and he sneezed. A puff of dust blew up into the air. I froze in terror. I was certain that Mr. Johnson would find us now. There was a horrible pause, and then the shelves started to move once again. Benny scrambled. He was afraid. His legs slipped over the edge of the shelf just as the bookcase he was starting moving against the back wall. If Benny couldn't pull himself up, he was going to be crushed. I leaned over to grab Benny's arms, but in doing so, I slipped too. And for a brief moment, Benny and I held on to each other, a bookcase between us, our feet dangling in the midair. I could see the wall getting closer and closer. Rafter, help! My grip gave out. I crashed down on the open aisle, landing on my feet, but ramming my shoulder against the shelf. I raced down the aisle. I moved to the back wall, terrified at what I would find. What I saw was my brother, his hands on the top shelf of the bookcase, his feet pressing against the wall behind him. I watched in amazement as he began to push the bookcase back. He looked heroic. He looked super. He was almost horizontal to the ground, keeping who knows how many bookcases from crushing him. But while Benny was pushing the top of the stack back, the bottom of the stack was still moving forward. I watched in horror as the books began to slide off the shelves. The bookcase started to lean until I was sure it was going to fall. A sharp crack pierced the library. It sounded like a tree branch snapping in two. "Uh-oh," I heard Benny say, and then he and the shelf went crashing to the ground. There was another crack as the first shelf tipped into the second one, and then the third, and then the fourth. Like dominoes, the shelves began tumbling over, books flying everywhere. Dust flew into the air, and a wave of the sound reverberated around the room. From his office, Mr. Wells shouted, "My library!" Benny staggered to his feet, tripping over books and shaking dust from his shirt. He looked up at me. I knew there was only one sensible thing to do. "Run!" He looked up at me. I sprinted towards the far side of the stacks, keeping low behind the toppled mounds of broken bookcases and books. Benny followed. Students were pouring into the library from the halls. Mr. Wells was yelling at everybody to stay back, but in just a few seconds, the library was filled with kids trying to see what happened. As soon as we were surrounded by students, Benny and I stealthily slipped out into the hall. We walked quickly to the nearest exit and then pushed out into the cold afternoon sun. And then we were running. Our feet were kicking up wet snow, racing along the wall of the school. "Did you see that?" Benny said. "Did you see what I did to the library?" "Oh, I saw." I turned the corner of the school. I skidded to a stop next to some bushes. "Let's just hope nobody else did." I put my hands on my knees. I was breathing hard. We made it. We came face to face with a super, and we still made it. We were safe. And then I heard feet crunching in the snow. Before I could move, Juanita was upon us. Enjoy this month, boys and girls, and the novel that we're reading.